I'll wait.
Oh. That's heavy then.
That'll work a little better. Our next couple is Miss Jordan Cause, escorted by Mr. Larry McCormick.
Yeah.
Next we have Miss Iris Three Irons, escorted by Mr. Andrew House. Our next couple is Miss Alexandria Bush, escorted by Mr. Cody Edwards. Our next couple is Mr. Tyler Espinoza, escorting Miss Courtney Chavez. And that concludes our royalty. Our next couple is Mr. Tyrell Big Lake, escorting Miss Sophia Oldcrow. Next we have Miss Brittany Shaw, escorted by Mr. Jordell Yarlett. Mr. Tyrus Lawton, escorting Miss Brandy Dare. Yes, they all look amazing. It's wonderful. Next we have Miss Maddie Flam, escorted by Mr. Johnny Morgan. Miss Ashley Ephelman, escorted by Mr. Trevin Bauman. Miss Carly Matt, escorted by Mr. Dustin Proctor.
Probably somewhere.
Miss Celia Corres, escorted by Mr. Dylan Dominguez. Miss Madison Chavez, escorted by Mr. Bobet. Miss Morgan Herman, escorted by Mr. Stetson Martin. Miss Kiara Bright Wings, escorted by Mr. Noah Tenbear. Miss Amina Littlelight, escorted by Mr. Brandon Little Owl. Miss Emily Harmer, escorted by Mr. Chad Nalen. We don't need another broken leg. Okay, we're good. Miss Maylee Stevens, escorted by Mr. Michael Neeser. Miss Sarah Prescott, escorted by Mr. Terrell Stewart. Miss Guan Yin Stevens, escorted by Mr. Ivan Not Afraid. Miss Kim Leslie, escorted by Mahmoud Mahmoudi. I'm really sorry. Poor guy. Miss Mina Black Eagle, escorted by Mr. Santana Andres. Miss Keisha Old Crane, escorted by Mr. Jonah Tenbear. Miss Jatara Pretty Whistle, escorted by Mr. Sean Ray James. Miss Taylor Evans, escorted by Mr. Cody Small. Miss Kasia Twin, escorted by Mr. Michael Parra. Miss Alexis Zint, escorted by Mr. Morgan Wolf. Miss Leanda Not Afraid, escorted by Mr. Mark Junker. Miss Jolie Oldbull, escorted by Mr. Shandon Medicine Horse. Miss Nami Duchesne, escorted by Mr. Trajan Hill. Miss Tessa Old Coyote, escorted by Mr. Jacinto Brin. Miss Tara Chavez, escorted by Mr. Trevor Edwards. Miss Kiana Mason, escorted by Mr. Merlin Whiter. Miss Stephanie Gomez, escorted by Mr. Christian Rowland. Miss Ashton Wilhelm, escorted by Mr. Gavin Betts. Miss Michaela Hageman, escorted by Mr. Remington Malenzik. Miss Cora Lockemeyer, escorted by Mr. Jake Lewis. Miss Lacey Gold, escorted by Mr. Tyler Robinson. Miss Alexandra Other Medicine, escorted by Mr. Caden Holds the Enemy. Miss Lainey Moonke, escorted by Mr. Eric LaFontaine. Miss Taylor Kohler, escorted by Mr. Chase Molina. Miss Ivana Wallace, escorted by Mr. Kyle Spotted Horse. Miss Bernice Huggs, escorted by Mr. Holman Rilbert. Miss Selena Salazar, escorted by Mr. Hunter Driftway. Miss Shayna Grensteiner, escorted by Mr. Philip Risingson. At this time, if you'd like to move into the room, you sure can, to give room for people behind you. But come on in and find seats or come along the sides, that's fine. But try not to block the doorway. There we go, move on down. Perfect. Just so we can keep the flow moving in and out. This front row of youngins back here, could we move forward so you're not standing in the doorway? Come down, there's empty seats. Thank you. Miss Kaylee Cummins, escorted by Mr. Jaron Whiteman. Miss Alyssa Lind, escorted by Mr. Lane Blankenship. Miss Trinae Phelan, escorted by Mr. Tavian Jefferson. Miss Sadie Small, escorted by Mr. Taj Birdham. Miss Michaela Three Irons, escorted by Mr. Mr. Stefan walks over ice. Miss Noemi Garcia, escorted by Mr. Gabe Bernigan. Miss Bethany Pretty on top, escorted by Mr. Frank Stewart. Miss Imani Kindness, escorted by Mr. Devon Spotted Horse. Miss Julia Ragland, escorted by Mr. Lorenzo Roenberg. Miss Tiana Tenbear, escorted by Mr. Blaze Cummins. Some of our girls have their dresses, they're starting to feel a little chill, so we decided we turned down the air. You're welcome. Miss Kara Benz, escorted by Mr. Cody Oldcrow. Miss Michaela Wilson, escorted by Mr. Gonzalo Godinez. Miss Nicole Halfpop, escorted by Mr. Chase Pilkington. Miss Mariah Frazier, escorted by Mr. Cordell Bird. Miss Shay Esk, escorted by Mr. Jalen Two-Legged. Miss Tabitha Schneider, accompanied by Miss Taven Spencer. Miss Gabby Greenfield, accompanied by Miss Mariah Donovan. Miss Elise Heyman, escorted by Mr. Colton Herrera. Miss Abby James, escorted by Mr. Jeremiah Jabs. Michaela Jefferson, escorted by Mr. Connor Murdoch. Miss Mashea Alden, escorted by Mr. Minrad Reithardt. Miss Nicole Needens, escorted by Mr. Anthony Wigner. The hardest part of this job is saying their names correctly. Miss Naya Rose Shoulderblade, accompanied by Miss Megan Hecro. Miss Sarah Edgar, escorted by Mr. Gideon Herbo. Miss Sarah Wong Fox and escorted by Mr. Colin Shames. Miss Marcelle Alden, escorted by Mr. Tremaine Whitebox. Miss Sadie Devers and Miss Brandy Conklin, escorted by Mr. Torrey Springfield. Oh, I'm sorry. I was admiring the flowers back here. Sorry. Easily distracted. Miss Savannah Green, escorted by Mr. Devin Sexton. Miss Burdine Pretty on Top, escorted by Mr. Chauncey Littlelegs. Miss Sloan Blankenship, escorted by Mr. Ben Schneider. Miss Holly Holtz and Miss Deshauna Anderson. Miss Tyra Redwolf, escorted by Mr. Caleb Wallace. Miss Charnay Two-Walls, escorted by Mr. Jared Cummins. Miss Stevie Red Dog, escorted by Mr. David James. Miss Nessa McLeod, escorted by Mr. Preston Badbear. Miss Aubrey Mywell, escorted by Mr. Jay Hutz. Miss Cora Poitra, escorted by Mr. Leighton Grovon. Miss Michelle Wall, escorted by Mr. Simran Hugs. Miss Marissa Putty Paint, escorted by Mr. Grant Scalpain. Miss Briley Takes Enemy, escorted by Mr. Josiah Badbear. Miss Amberly Whiteman and Miss Jewel Oldbull. And our last couple. Miss Soraya Deputy, escorted by Mr. Andrew Plentyhawk.